So I'm gonna tell an extremely condensed version um, of the awakening of Siddhartha as the Buddha. I may get some of the details wrong. I know the stories differ on some of these, and then I'm gonna circle back and point out at least one, maybe a few insights. What do I got going on here? There we go. A few insights that I think can be interesting and helpful. So in a nutshell, about 2,500 years ago, Siddhartha is born in what is now around the borderland of India and Nepal. He's born as a prince. He's raised in the palace. And according to legend, the first 29 years of his life are extremely what we would call sheltered and privileged. He's living within the palace walls. He has everything he could possibly need and much of what he wants. And most importantly, he's utterly unaware, utterly oblivious to the facts of old age, sickness, and death. As far as he can tell in this sheltered state, life is just one day after another of pleasure and abundance and all good. I'm in a Kuna Matata situation, you might say. Then he makes 4 trips outside of the palace walls. The first time he goes out, he sees an old man, and he is confronted with the reality of aging. Second time he goes out, he sees a sick person. He's confronted with the reality of illness. The third time he goes out, he sees a corpse. He's confronted with the reality of death. And then the fourth time he goes out, he sees a wandering spiritual seeker. And so he's confronted / introduced to the possibility of going out in the world and seeking a different way. And so that's exactly what he does. Leaves the palace, leaves his comforts, leaves his family behind, and spends this next 6 years trying to find his way to essentially liberation from the suffering that began when he realized that he and all the people he knew would get old, would get sick, and would die. And so he studies with some of the best teachers of the day to try to learn their techniques, takes it, does what he can with it, realizes this isn't really getting to the root of what I'm looking for. Practices asceticism, right, which is intense self-denial for about 5 or 6 years with some fellows of his. Again, takes it to the extreme. Being the Buddha, he practices about as well as you can, or being Siddhartha, I should say at this point. Practices as well as he can, but doesn't get to the root of what he's looking for. Doesn't get really under that root of suffering that began when he began to realize that life involved decay and ultimately death. And it was only after he adopted the middle way, which is not going into the extreme of luxury, which he had in the palace, and not going into the extremes of self-denial, which he had during his years of asceticism, by engaging the middle way. This was how he was able to achieve enlightenment, which he did under the Bodhi tree. He sat under the Bodhi tree, resolved himself to not rise from his sitting until he achieved enlightenment. And the main challenge he had is that while he was sitting, Mara, which is essentially the god of temptation, mischief, and evil, visited Siddhartha and tried to derail his progress by parading in front of him temptations of beautiful women, promises of power, warring armies, anything to kind of throw him off the path of poise and equanimity, and to get him to tilt into some kind of either chasing, right, infatuation, or aversion or avoidance, or in some way to tip him back into ignorance. But Siddhartha overcame this. He transcended it, according to the legend, when the armies of Mara said, we are your witness, trying to essentially wrap him into a mutual combat framing with them. He transcended it by touching the earth and inviting the earth to announce itself as his witness. And from that, he then became enlightened, became aware of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Okay, so that was an extremely condensed version of the enlightenment story. I may have got some of the details wrong, and I certainly left some details out that you read in some versions of it. But I think for my purposes, at least, it'll capture the main things I want to talk about. So one thing that I think is kind of interesting to note here is the fact that ignorance is bliss. From what I've seen in the accounts, and if you kind of think about it from the perspective of the young man living the experience, the first 29 years of his life were likely free from suffering, other than any physical pains. Maybe when he was playing sports or something, he twisted his ankle or something like that. But it sounds like he was so sheltered and shielded from the harsh realities of life that for those 29 years, he did not suffer in the sense that Buddhists talk about the word suffering. And I just think that's kind of an interesting quirk or fact of the story. We think of the sheltered or privileged existence as being kind of a cocoon, a place of ignorance, a place of denial. And undeniably it is. And yet it was also a 29-year stretch where he didn't suffer. And if the ultimate purpose of his mission was the end of suffering, it's interesting here that we see in his story actually the beginning of his suffering, which is in that 29th year when he takes his steps out of the palace. So when he leaves the palace and he has those first three confrontations, sees the old person, sees the sick person, sees the dead person. What I think is interesting about this is the suffering he experiences isn't that he himself is old, sick, or dying, right? It's actually kind of a vicarious suffering. He looks at these people and then realizes he too is a person who's going to go through these experiences, and the people that he knows and loves and cares about are going to go through it as well. So it doesn't sound necessarily like it was a birth of compassion in him, although of course that may have been there too. It was really more of a realization in his mind of what his fate was going to be in terms of his body and his health, and what the fate of the other people he loved was going to be. And the dissatisfaction that arose in him was actually a disagreement with this reality, a contentiousness with this reality. And I think it's worth pausing here to realize what's actually happened here. It's as though the seed of suffering was planted in him at this point. The recognition of the body's process, combined with his recognition of himself as a body, and his recognition that he himself had not come to terms with the fact that those things were going to happen with him. It was that dissatisfaction, right, which is one of the translations of dukkha, that actually spawned the suffering in him, which then created the need and the desire in his part to go out and to purge himself of the suffering. So again, just kind of an interesting quirk of his story. He is not suffering in the palace. He goes out, sees reality, and it's actually his contention with reality, his dissatisfaction with reality, his dispute with reality, the fact that reality involves aging, suffering, and death. This was the root of his suffering. This is what actually created in him the need or the desire to go out and to heal himself. And I think another interesting factor is, if we look at this, what we see is he doesn't go out on some enterprising mission in the world to cure all the illnesses, right? To end old age, to cure the problem of death. And I think what's telling about that is it demonstrates where the origin of suffering lies. We can't be in the palace forever, right? At some point, we're going to be exposed to the realities of old age, sickness, and death. And we're going to have the dissatisfaction that arises with them. And at that point, we essentially have two options, right? The route of the ego, which is to see all the problems as being out there in the world, right? Beyond the barrier of the skin, out there is where the issue is. There's where old age is. There's where sickness is. There's where death is. And so I'm either going to go out and fight them, right? Try to end them, or I'm going to retreat back into the palace and essentially try to hide from them and deny them. But once the cat's out of the bag, right, you can't really do that. So Siddhartha knew he couldn't go back in the palace. And wisely he knew if he were to go out spending his life essentially crusading against old age, sickness, and death, one, it would be futile, and two, it would be an ego game. His mind would be playing with himself just to keep himself distracted, right? So instead of being distracted in the palace by, insulating himself from the pain of aging, sickness, and death, he would be out in the world kind of like Don Quixote, tilting at the windmills and trying to sell himself the story that he was trying to end his own suffering by eliminating the external threats, instead of realizing that old age, sickness, and death were actually programmed into his body. They were inevitabilities. And so all he could really do as a gift to himself at that point was to pull out the thorn that had grown in his heart, this thorn of dissatisfaction, this form of not accepting, of disputing, of contending with the facts of old age, suffering, and death. Because while the dissatisfaction itself is a reality, the dissatisfaction is based on a false premise, which is that one cannot come to peace with the facts of old age, suffering, and death. The false premise being that they always need to be something that's bothersome, that's worrisome, that one cannot be satisfied while being aware of. We also then see, and this, I've talked in another video about the bow tie, right? Being an image of the middle way, right? So Siddhartha lives the first half of his life, the first 29 years, I should say, in one end of the bow tie, which is the bow tie of indulgence and worldly pleasure. He then, after his 4 trips out of the palace, goes into the other side of the bow tie, which is the bow tie of self-denial, of trying to escape the world, trying to escape pleasure, trying to escape self-indulgence, to try to find escape or release in the other end of the spectrum. So you might say indulgence on one end, denial on the other. And he doesn't find it either place. He only finds it when he goes back into the center of the bow tie, in the middle way, not into any extreme, not into any absolutism, but essentially accepting life as it comes and not seeing life as something that he needs to kind of funnel into one extreme position or the other. And, I think at this point I'm kind of riffing on things I notice as I go through this story. That kind of maps with the 3 poisons that the Buddha later teaches about once he's enlightened, which are aversion, infatuation, and ignorance, right? And you can kind of see those mapped onto his life as well. The infatuation mapping onto those first 29 years when he's in the palace. He's got everything he needs. He's essentially, at that point, infatuated with the world, because on a deep subconscious level, his infatuation with the pleasure and the easiness of his life is essentially allowing him to remain in denial of what he, on a deeper level, likely already knew, but was able to remain in obliviousness to, which was the fact that it wasn't always going to be this way. And that no matter how nice and pleasurable life had been for him in those 29 years, the bell was going to toll, and his body was going to decay. He and his loved ones were going to get ill, and eventually he and his loved ones would die. The other one, which is aversion, right, the second poison, is reflected in his 5 to 6 years living as an ascetic. He essentially developed an aversion to earthly pleasure, an aversion to eating food to the point of satisfaction, an aversion to keeping a healthy, functioning, well-muscled body. He essentially tried to waste away his body, right, mortify his body, as some people have described it, in a way that was almost an aversion, right, a counter-reaction to the life he had lived in the palace. So I think it's just interesting, and it's a testament to the quality of this legend. You may even call it the quality of the myth, that in kind of the bones of the story, the very themes that the character in the story tends to bring out in his teachings are actually interwoven. You can see in the structure of the 3 poisons, the life in the palace, the life of asceticism, and then the ignorance that he was trying to overcome in both extremes. You see in the truth of suffering, which is that suffering can only be resolved within, and that the resolution of suffering is not in denying the existence of old age, suffering, and death, or of conquering old age, suffering, and death, but essentially making peace with old age, suffering, and death, and then using that practice of making peace and expanding it out into essentially a habit that you can apply to the entirety of existence, such that nothing has any lasting effect of bothering you anymore. Because what you realize is the greatest gift you can give yourself is to stop arguing with reality, right? As Byron Katie says it, to stop arguing with what is and to start loving with what is, right? Because otherwise you'll just spend your life slashing like a machete at one thing or another, or hiding in a cave away from one thing or another, always dissatisfied, always scared of the unsatisfactory thing coming, instead of doing the more difficult inner work of essentially seeing dissatisfactoriness for the fool's game that it is, deconditioning the body from all of its addictions to satisfactoriness, and allowing our desires to arise and fall in awareness along with everything else. I think another interesting part of the story, or something that kind of sticks out to me, is Mara. Mara this, god of illusion, of deceit, of mischief, of evil, comes to the Buddha when the Buddha is trying to enlighten, and essentially tries to sabotage him, right? Tries to get in his way. And it's just such a testament to the poise he had achieved that he doesn't see Mara as an enemy, even though Mara has clearly cast him or herself as an enemy in Mara's story. And I think it speaks to one of the powerful techniques that one can use to essentially achieve or emulate Buddhahood, which is not accepting the framings that are presented to you, including the framings presented by other beings or other entities. So Mara comes and Mara says, essentially, I'm going to seduce you. I'm going to try to overrun you. I'm going to try to kind of topple you off of your saddle. I'm going to do whatever it takes to kind of break you down and to get you off this path that you're on. And, I think a tempting thing to do would have been to assume the ego position, which is to go, screw you, Mara. You think you're tough. You think you're resourceful. I'm tougher. I'm more resourceful. Notice, though, how that what you're doing at this point is essentially sinking to Mara's level. Now you're playing Mara's game. You're not going to beat Mara at Mara's own game. And you're essentially reinforcing your own ego. And kind of the unspoken presence there is, I am dissatisfied with Mara being here. It is unacceptable that Mara is here. And so I'm going to do what it takes to uproot Mara from my life, right? Just as I want to avoid the inconvenient truths of old age, suffering, and death, I want to get the inconvenient truth of Mara out of my field of awareness so I can get back to my business of becoming enlightened, right? Mara, like this pesky fly or mosquito, this snake coiling around my leg. I got to get Mara out of here, right? And what does the Buddha teach by example? Don't accept the framing of hostility. Don't accept the framing of antagonization. You define your own framing with your own poise, with your own intention, with your own commitment, right? This is the first step of the Eightfold Path, is right view. And if you are steadfast in your view that there is no enemy in the world, if you're steadfast in your view that everything that occurs, that everything that comes into your field of awareness is actually there ultimately for your benefit. And I say ultimately because this is another opportunity to see the framing. If you say, okay, I'll go with you on this. Everything that arises, everything that appears to me in my life is for my benefit. But then you think of yourself only as a human being, and you think of this as the only life of your existence. You're very quickly going to stop believing this story, right? Because every time you get sick, every time a snake bites you, right? Every time someone you love passes away, every time you are robbed, right? Every time you are slighted, you're going to look at this and you're going to say, I don't like this. This is not for my benefit. Let's say you actually see in the moments leading up to your death, someone comes by and someone just smacks you across the face and insults you and spits on you, right? And as you feel death coming, you're thinking, how the hell is that going to be for my benefit? What a bunch of nonsense. What a lie. What an opiate of the masses to keep me content, right? And this is where that deeper teaching of anatta, of non-self that the Buddha teaches is so important. Don't get stuck in the framing of thinking all the benefits that are going to come to me need to come to me in this life. Recognize this life for what it is, which is essentially irreducible. I wouldn't presume to say what it is. I will say that my sense of things is that it is many things, one of which is kind of a God school, a training for our spirit or for our soul to become more unconditionally loving, to become more selfless, to become more attuned to the truths and the wisdom of how suffering is overcome and lasting peace and well-being is achieved, right? And essentially how thriving is achieved in a life, which is making peace with the fact that everything's not going to feel good and everything's not going to seem good to our ego. But if we have the faith that everything ultimately is good, is being created for our benefit, if not in this lifetime, for our spirit and our soul, which transcends this lifetime and manifests in many other lifetimes before and after. And if we see it as essentially the training and the nurturing and the cultivating of our soul, the development into our soul, into a more pure expression of the Godhead, into a more pure expression of lovingness. And we see those trials and tribulations as actually what helps us overcome our petty selfishness, our clinging, and what allows us to reach our fuller expression of ourself. Now we can begin to see more and more what the Buddha was talking about, and how the Buddha was able to have that poise and that equanimity to actually smile back at Mara and to say, Mara, I know you. I know what you are. You too are ultimately God. You too were put in my path for the purpose of my benefit. And so if I antagonize you, if I hate you, if I despise you, if I see you as a nuisance that needs to be uprooted, I'm actually falling back into the poison of ignorance, because I'm treating you as something relative to my ego, right? A hindrance. Instead of seeing you at what you are in the ultimate perspective, which is essentially an inextricable part of the I am, part of my dharma, right? Part of my teaching, part of my development, something that's here for my benefit. And in the Buddha's case, he had the gift of insight. He actually could likely see in an instant the role Mara was going to play in his awakening. Let's notice here, Mara, though Mara cast him or herself as a villain in the Buddha's story, is actually an inextricable part and a friend to the Buddha, because it was Mara that showed Buddha what the Buddha needed to overcome, needed to transcend in order to achieve the enlightenment. If the Buddha's path, both leading up to his meditation under the Bodhi tree and during his meditation in the Bodhi tree, had been all lilies and butterfly and warm radiant sunshine, he would likely have not gained the insights he needed and had the inner transformation he needed to transition from being Siddhartha, human being, to Siddhartha, the enlightened one, Siddhartha the Buddha. And so I think it's just an invitation to recognize the Mara in our life, right, which is everywhere, and which is always, when it's operating on us, always within. The only Mara that ever harms us is the Mara that we're manifesting within us, within our own private mind, our own private decision making, and recognize Mara simultaneously as a teacher who we should not heed, right? We should not heed Mara's teachings as wise and something we should just follow. And simultaneously, we should not resent Mara. We should have gratitude, because Mara, like all things, is arising for our benefit. And if we can recognize Mara for what it is, right, which is the evil one, the one whose words should not be heeded, but whose role should be respected and actually be seen with gratitude, then we could see Mara as, like the Buddha saw Mara, which is a step on the path to enlightenment, and really a friend who came along at the opportune time to provide the role that was needed for Buddha to move forward. Mara is Buddha. Buddha is Mara. In the manifestations in this physical realm, Buddha is the manifestation of our enlightenment, and Mara is the manifestation of our evil. And the beautiful demonstration of the story of the Buddha, one of many beautiful demonstrations, is how inextricable Mara is from Buddhahood, how inextricable deceit, and essentially the mirror games, the hall of mirrors, the labyrinth of the mind, how it is not some accident, how it isn't some hell, how it's not some torture chamber we're put in arbitrarily or sadistically. Everything that's arising, every single aspect of it, every pixel, every smidgen, every nook, every cranny, every bit of it we glimpse through our side eye, every bit of it is here for our enlightenment, is here for our benefit, is here for our growth. And so if we can simultaneously say, Mara, I see you, no thank you, and thank you, that seems to be an emulation of Buddhahood that we can all practice in our day-to-day lives. And just remember, we're not doing this condescendingly to the manifestation of Mara in the other. The manifestation of Mara in the other is something that always deserves respect. And as Byron Katie wisely says, that's their business, right? And it's foolish for us and egotistical of us to get involved in other people's business. So unless someone invites you to help them with their Mara, let that Mara be. Look for that Mara within us each and say to Mara, I know you, no thank you, and thank you.